Hello, everyone. My name is Colton Bernasol, and I am managing editor for The Bias. And I'm here to talk with Dr. Matthew McManus, who is an assistant professor in political science at Spelman College. He is a regular writer for The Bias, prolific author. We've interviewed him on some of his books, and has a contributing piece to our forthcoming print edition of the magazine, The Radical Hope. So we're here to talk about his piece, The Faith Imperative of Socialism. Hi, Matt. Thanks for sitting down and talk with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And also, congratulations on the magazine. Honestly, it's beautiful to finally see it physically.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you're framing hope in relationship to the socialist tradition. So you open up the essay talking about the hope as essential to sustaining and building a socialist movement, and you turn pretty quickly to thinking about hope in foundational thinkers like Karl Marx.
A lot of this essay was inspired by my reading of people like Marx, as you mentioned, but
Mm.
also theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, Tillich, who's always a constant touchstone for me, Gary Dorian and MLK, and a few others. A lot of people in the kind of broadly American and German theological socialist traditions. There's this longstanding view on the socialist left that adopts what G.A. Cohn called the obstetric vision of history that you find in some
Mhm.
versions of Marxism. Basically, the idea is that for all, Marx was a fierce critic of power, very aware of the kind of ubiquity of the capitalist mode of production and how it spread across the globe. We didn't really need to worry that one day it was all going to come crashing down and a better world was going to replace it, because there's this very orthodox Marxist view that held, we know that that's what's going to happen. The science of history dictates that one day the contradictions intrinsic to capitalism are going to bring it down. We're going to transition to socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it. The free development of each will be preconditioned for the free development of all. All of us will hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and criticize and philosophize in the evening. What I point out in this piece is that definitely after the 1990s, but I would say even before, going back to the 1930s, this was pretty naive. This
Mm.
idea that history was going to do all the work for us, and all we needed to do was give it a little push, try to go a bit faster, just seems profoundly unrealistic. And what this really brings about is a need to reconsider the value of hope for socialist movements. Because what's characteristic of hope, and what theologians have always understood hope to be, is it doesn't come with guarantees. There's no necessity that things are going to go your way. You just have to put your faith in the view that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it should bend towards justice given enough
Mhm.
time.
Yeah, I think in the essay you describe at least one way of reading Marx, and maybe one account of his history, as offering a providential account of history. More basic way of saying this is that socialism is inevitable, it's fated. But you also point out that this philosophy of history isn't necessarily unique to Marx.
No, of course not, right? Over the course of the 19th century, even going back to the 18th, there were many utopian or aspirational figures that felt that the world was preordained to get better, and
Mm.
that their own science of history or vision of history or theory of history dictated that it was just going to be so. You can
Mm.
think about the work of people like Auguste Comte, obviously Hegel, who was himself a huge influence on Marx, Immanuel Kant, wasn't quite as optimistic as some of the others, but by and large thought that the human society is becoming more enlightened, and that consequently people would become more intelligent and more self-governing over time. You can just pick out somebody from the 19th
Mm.
century and they probably have this kind of vision. And of course, socialism internalized a lot of these ways of thinking about things. And Marx did as well. I think that the political theorist Sheldon Wolin had a very sharp critique of at least some aspects of Marx's thought, where he pointed out, obviously Marx was a great genius who probably did more than anyone else to make us aware of the ways that power, ideology, fetishism operate in society. And the kind of unusual thing, or perhaps a psychological necessity on his part, was for all he was very aware of the way that power blocked the road towards a higher form of society, seems to have indulged in a little bit of utopian beliefs that, somehow or another, despite the kind of power that capital wielded over the globe, it was all preordained to come crashing down. I just think that that is not necessarily a conceit that we can allow ourselves now in the 21st century, in the aftermath of, a century that was nothing if not brutal.
You juxtapose this naive utopian account of hope with a realist hope. And you mentioned earlier Niebuhr, but also theologians like Paul Tillich. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this Christian realist socialist hope of yours.
Niebuhr, as some might know, was one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. His own political trajectory was quite complicated. He grew up in a reasonably conservative family, later on became increasingly radical to the point where in the 1930s he was very much a Marxist, unapologetically, at a time when that was quite a dangerous thing to be in the United States. Then in the 1940s and 1950s, he began to moderate his position, acclimated himself to a kind of New Deal liberalism that was critical of things like Soviet communism and radical forms of leftism. But then by the 1960s, he seems to have reverted back to some of his old left-wing instincts as he became very critical of American imperialism, particularly intervention in the Vietnam War, although he initially had more of an ambiguous position on this. So one of the things that I really admire about Niebuhr is even when he was wrong, as he himself would often admit that he was, he never stopped trying to understand the world as it presented itself to him. He wasn't dogmatic. The main work that I draw on from this piece is his 1940s work on the children of light and the children of darkness. One of the really stirring mantras in this book, which includes, amongst other things, a deep theological justification for democratic socialism, is his argument that democratic socialism is not a utopian project in the sense of expecting that all human beings are going to be morally perfected by a transition to a more democratic economy. Actually, Niebuhr thinks that we need democratic socialism precisely because the 20th century and experiments with totalitarianism have shown us how corruptible human beings are and how sinful we can be. Now, this might seem like an odd way to support democratic socialism, but it's a profound one, in my opinion, because what Niebuhr says is, look, if you really think that human beings are, as so many conservatives insist, sinful, prone to wickedness, prone to selfishness, then why would you want a capitalist system that affirms a lot of these tendencies on our part and calls for them to be rewarded? Isn't there something deeply threatening about the concentrations of power, particularly economic and eventually political power, that capitalism facilitates? So in many senses, democratic socialism is the most realistic option for a flawed species like ourselves, because it eliminates the potential for us to give in to our worst impulses by denying very wicked people access to the kind of economic resources they need to make the world a worse place for the rest of us. And in an era that we've seen billionaire oligarchs cause tremendous damage to the environment, to the lives of minorities, to LGBTQ people, think about Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Trump family. I think that Niebuhr's warning and his call for democratic socialism during this period seems more prescient than it ever has been before.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about how this realist hope is sustained. So, if it's not history outside of human action that allows us to hope or kind of sustains us in the midst of what feels like the permanence of structures like capitalism, then where does sustenance of hope come from?
Different Christian socialists are going to find hope in different areas. Many people I know put their faith in God and the idea that even if there's no necessary plan for history, nonetheless, God's will see itself enacted in the world, and eventually he'll tip the scales towards justice. There's this kind of eucatastrophic idea that just as there's catastrophes, so too can there sometimes be moments of benevolence that appear in history. That's not my view, personally. Where I derive most of my hope from is from other people. I very much agree with people like Custer McIntyre. A lot of the meaning that we get in our life comes from our relationships with others, that this has been deeply misunderstood by many people who are the most vigorous proponents of capitalism. And when we spend our time interacting with others and realize that a lot of the meaning of our lives comes from them, what we realize is that we cannot hand off to others, especially future generations, a world that is far more ruined than the one that we ourselves inherited. That's just a profoundly wicked thing to do. And so my hope, which comes without guarantees, is that we'll find the moral fortitude within ourselves to live lives that are meaningful enough in order to prevent a catastrophe like that from occurring.
What I hear you saying is hope becomes rerouted in communities and particularly in movements. So there's this sense in which hope is not necessarily kind of an individual virtue, but actually emerges collectively. It's a democratic virtue. It's a virtue that's shared. I'm wondering, kind of along these lines, where you see movements for hope today, especially in relationship to the rise of capitalist oligarchs. Just as it seems like there's nothing left to turn into capital, these companies find more and more devious ways to do that, whether it's in building of data centers, expansion of the AI industry across the world. So where do you see movements of sustainable hope that gesture toward or bear witness toward this democratic socialism that you see as the ideal we ought to strive for?
I actually am a bit more optimistic about this than I would have been even 2 more years ago. Maybe that's just because I'm in a good mood today, but I'll just give three examples, two from the United States and then one from my home country, Canada. First off, I've been to three No Kings rallies now. At every single one of them, what has been affirmed is that there were many people who felt that they were alone in terms
Mm,
of how they experienced our current crises. And it turned out that we were not alone, that there were millions upon millions of people in this country alone that
mm,
felt very much like we did and were willing to put themselves at risk to go out there and to make a statement that, and I think that that was a very edifying display. And I can tell you
mm,
that I think one of the reasons there have been successive rallies centered around this theme of no kings is precisely because people need to band together and to feel
mm,
that they're not alone in that kind of way. The
mm,
second thing that's really given me a lot more optimism recently, the country was not moving and the world was not moving in the direction that was just and appropriate in the United States, is we've seen socialist politicians get elected into office, particularly offices that are prestigious and well known. Obvious one, of course, is Zoran Mamdani. I know leftists all across the world who are inspired by his example. Canada, England, people in India, you name it. I think that one of the things that's so refreshing about Mamdani is if you look at the way that he reaches out to people, the weird thing is that the socialist mayor of New York seems like the most normal and happy person in the entire country. He
mm,
loves his job. He loves making the city more affordable and more livable, particularly for New Yorkers. And he's very zealous in going about his duties. That's one of the reasons why you see people, even who disagree with democratic socialism, pay a lot of respect to his style of politics. And I think that we're seeing other people emulate that and learning from it all across the country. I mean, just here in Atlanta, we elected a city councilwoman around the same time as Mondani. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that many people in this city want to change.
mm,
So that's another reason for hope. And then the last thing that I'm thinking of is in my home country, Canada, we actually had a socialist party for a very long time, the New Democratic
mm,
Party. That has an auspicious history in the country. The primary vehicle through which things like public health care was achieved in Canada. Beloved national institution, although it's been criminally underfunded for a long time now,
mm,
particularly by conservative governments like Doug Ford in my home province of Ontario. But in recent years, the New Democratic Party has, without a doubt, moved further away from its socialist roots and tried to pivot towards the center. You saw that under leaders like Tom Mulcair and Jagmeet Singh, who were both nice men, right? I'm not kind of calling them out personally, but I don't think that they were appropriate leaders for these troubled times.
mm,
By contrast, we now have a leader in Avi Lewis who is very willing to call power out and to try to make the country a better place, and who is unambiguous about embracing democratic socialism as a label and to try to rebuild the bona fides of socialism in Canada, where, again, I like to stress, it has deep roots. So all three of those things have made me somewhat more optimistic that there is reason for hope in our current era. Although, again,
mm,
these are
mm.
all pretty fragile sprouts. We have to make sure to cultivate them carefully if we don't want them to get eradicated too quickly.
What I think is really interesting about this account is how a realist account of hope is able to both affirm, say, the necessity of mass mobilization campaigns like No Kings, which might not necessarily be as on the left, say, as the vision for democratic socialism, and yet insists on what kinds of political possibilities can emerge from those campaigns in hoping for something that far exceeds maybe the vision that's there, that mass mobilization becomes important. I'm reminded of John Berger, a novelist, essayist, who writes about mass mobilization and mass movements as rehearsals
Mhm.
for the revolution. It's where people discover as collectives their political power and their political agency. That does seem to me to be a discovery filled with hope.
They're expressions of which solidarity ought to be. Here, I think we can posit the difference between left wing solidarity and what we call faux right wing versions of
Mm,
solidarity, the sort that are very popular right now. I think that one of the reasons why right wing populism has appealed to many people is it promises a certain kind of anti individualism and community, and its emphasis on this idea of national belonging
mm,
and exclusion, right? You belong to this nation. Everyone else is going to be kicked out, and this is going to be your country. It's going to belong to you. Again, there's this idea of exclusionary ownership that's so
mm,
important to these versions of nationalism. Obviously, this is a powerful idea, right? This notion of belonging, whether to a nation or anything else, because enticed millions upon millions of people who ideally should support left-wing causes to support someone like Donald Trump. But I think that ultimately, what makes right-wing populism and right-wing forms of solidarity so dishonest, or at least so inauthentic, is that they never have any kind of materiality to them, right? It all operates at a kind of ephemeral, idealist level where you're supposed to be part of this imagined community, the nation,
mm,
that is going to exclude another imagined group from participation. And that's supposed to make everyone feel better. Left wing forms of solidarity, and this is, I think, where our realism comes in, always have to have material dimension to it, right?
Mm,
We are supposed to provide for the needs of our neighbor as we provide for our own needs. And that sometimes will entail being not self-sacrificing, right, but other-minded. We internalize their needs in the same way that we often would internalize our own. And I think that these displays of solidarity, left-wing solidarity that you see, where people are marching together, providing for one another, celebrating with one another, supporting one another in times of political or economic need. Think about what happened not too long ago in Minnesota, right? It's another very
mm,
good example of that, right? They're demonstrating to people just how much more powerful our idea and how much more real our idea of solidarity is than again the faux
mm,
ideas of solidarity and community offered by the right. And again, there's good theological ways of thinking about this.
mm,
A really good example of this would, of course, be in Paul Tillich's The Socialist Decision, where he talks
mhm,
about how even in the 1920s and the 1930s, the right would offer this kind of solidarity of blood,
mm.
Volkish blood and soil type sensibility that really had nothing of value to give to the working classes, but at least was seemed more tangible to them and more promising to them than the kind of hyper individualism and egoism which had bent them under the capitalist mode of production.
This is such a good point, and I think it's a great place to wrap it up. The realist, socialist, and Christian hope that you're speaking about presents a vision of solidarity that is transnational in scope. It breaks through the fictions of the nation. If you're interested in hearing more or learning more about Matt's work, you can check his writing out at our website. Thank you again, Matt.
Yeah, Colton, thanks a lot, man. Take care.